Warning. This video contains heavy spoilers for AI The Somnium Files Nirvana Initiative, as well as spoilers for AI The Somnium Files. Come back after you've beaten those games if you do not want to be spoiled.
Howdy, Frayers. So, AI The Somnium Files Nirvana Initiative was an interesting experience, to say the least. One could go as far as to say enlightening, perhaps. Being an almost entirely story-based mystery game of sorts, I wanted to take some time to let my thoughts on the game marinate, so to speak, as well as gauge some of the internet's reactions, theories, and opinions to better formulate my own. Anyways, from what I can gather, AI 2, which is what I will be affectionately referring to it as from here on out, seems to lean heavily into classic Uchikoshi bullshit with the misdirection and plot twists and such. And I mean that in a good way, of course. Now, personally, while I played and very much enjoyed AI 1, I never played the Zero Escape series, although I did really enjoy the memes, so I watched some playthroughs and read up on what happened. But anyways, I was pretty susceptible to the narrative tactics employed by AI 2. But I have seen people who were less impressed with the game, criticizing the recycling of plot twists to an extent. I'm not entirely sure how true that is, but playing through the game I can definitely see how one might potentially be underwhelmed by some of the major reveals, and the grand plot twist near the end didn't seem to have quite as big of an impact as the body swap reveal in AI 1. Now that being said, both the timeline plot twist and the reveal of the second Mizuki both caught me off guard, and I genuinely did find them to be interesting and decently well implemented. When the timeline plot twist was explained in-game, I legitimately just kinda sat in front of the screen for a solid few minutes, just trying to parse the information being presented and trying to work out how it was possible. Admittedly, it took me an embarrassingly long time for me to realize that the Mizuki that we thought we were playing as in the newly revealed to be past segments was actually the other Mizuki, or Bibi as the game refers to her. And of course, like with any good plot twist, it's been really fascinating being able to go back and pick up on hints scattered throughout earlier parts of the story that take on new context with the twist in mind. On the other hand, I can sort of see how it might have not been as well received by some. As alluded to earlier, the game does seem to play it somewhat close to the heart with the Uchikoshi writing formula. While I didn't necessarily see the twist itself coming per se, I was definitely keeping an eye out for a major plot reveal that would recontextualize all prior events of the game. Of course, that isn't to say that Uchikoshi invented the use of major plot twists in mystery genre stories, but even having only played AI 1, I felt that the nature of the reveal definitely carried a similar vibe, to put it broadly. To compare this to a different aspect of the game, the random musical numbers work as a perfect example. Iris breaking out into song and dance with Invincible Rainbow Arrow came pretty much out of left field, and it wasn't just a one-off gag, but a recurring element that ultimately made its way into the ending scene of the game. And even though the song was extremely cheesy and possibly even intentionally cringe, it was so shamelessly over the top that it looped back around to being charming and made for one of the most memorable end credit scenes I've experienced in any video game to date. Such a cheery song and dance with the whole cast being used to cap off an otherwise pretty dark murder mystery worked surprisingly well, and for better or worse, was at the very least memorable. Now, Half to Whole on the other hand, the new song for AI 2, sung by Kizuna Chieda, attempts to capture similar lightning in a bottle. I'm not so above it all to say that the song isn't infectiously catchy and enjoyable, and to be honest, I would have been very let down if the end credits scene for the game didn't end with another full cast dance sequence. But I think it goes without saying that it didn't have the same impact as Invincible Rainbow Arrow, just because we've come to expect that kind of thing from the game. Gotta give credit where it's due though. Emily did a great job with the vocals, and the lyric about eating donuts in the bathroom has lived rent-free in my mind ever since the first time I played the game. As a whole, it does seem that AI 2 is trying to recapture the experience of AI 1, which does make a bit of sense, as while the game is definitely a sequel by all conventional definitions, Spike Chunsoft seemingly is trying to position AI 2 as a proper starting point for the series, something which arguably is negatively impactful on the narrative, especially for those who prefer Falco Date. Now, with that being said, however, I don't want any misunderstandings that AI2 doesn't feel fresh or that it lacks its own identity. This truly is a case of the journey being more important than the destination at times. The witty banter and character interactions are what set the Somnium games apart from other similar series, and AI2 doesn't disappoint. While the two main character pairings of Ryuki and Tama and then Mizuki and Aiba weren't quite as enjoyable in my opinion as Date and Aiba from the first game, I would also argue that it's a pretty unreachable bar, and splitting the spotlight between the protagonists didn't really do them any favors either. Perhaps that's an issue that could be alleviated by a third game giving them more screen time in the future. Well, that brings us to the other common criticism I've seen, which concerns the very nature of the plot twist. Since the twist concerns meta elements like the timeline of events and how it's presented to the player, there are those who find it to be cheap. The twist being an unreliable narrator type reveal combined with how it was randomly exposition dumped by Mama, who gained the inexplicable ability to break the fourth wall for seemingly no other reason, didn't really sit well with everyone. And while part of this unexpected development did impact the cast, namely being the unmasking of Bibi as essentially a clone of Mizuki, having the bulk of the shock value come from basically a fourth wall break that was more for the player rather than the characters in the game was a bold move, to say the least. The reveal of the second Mizuki that happens around the same time and is integral to explaining how the timeline trick even worked was also a major reveal for both the players and the main character, but that also comes with its own smaller can of worms, namely the suspension of disbelief that Bibi from 6 years ago is virtually identical to present-day Mizuki in outfit, mannerisms, etc. I've seen all sorts of opinions, ranging from it being a cheap attempt to add shock value to being an interesting way to draw parallels to the events of 6 years past and present, while also tying Mizuki into the overarching plot and giving her an actual backstory. I suppose it's largely up to player interpretation at that point. Uchikoshi games are definitely no stranger to controversial narrative elements, of course. Now, the most interesting and likely explanation I've heard tossed around was that the shifting timeline was supposed to represent how Ryuki himself was experiencing the events of the game, having his memories and thoughts jumbled around thanks to the cursed kanji living in his brain and the TC Purge virus. Usually mental delusions make for pretty shaky storytelling, but if that is indeed what the writers were going for, I do think that it makes for a pretty decent in-universe explanation. It's a decent theory, and it does have plenty of legs to stand on, like the Shoma Ferris wheel scene. Regarding Ryuki's psyche though, the final point of interest on the docket for this video is the nil number and Tokiko's machinations to reach moksha. This was a really fascinating aspect of the game that somehow felt both like a grand reveal in its own right that overshadows everything else in the game, and also a bit of a rushed afterthought or even a gag event. I just can't believe that every copy of AI The Somnium Files Nirvana initiative really is personalized. This short scenario has been the subject of a ton of discussion. It manages to catapult Tokiko from being an underutilized side character who dies in the first act to one of the most interesting facets of the whole story. Ultimately, it does leave a lot up to player interpretation, unfortunately. The implication is that Tokiko was the true mastermind behind everything, manipulating even Terror himself, but then would that make the Diverge chapter the canon ending? Can there even be a canon ending in that case? If they make an AI 3, it would likely continue off of the quote-unquote golden ending with the big fight scene and the dance number and everything, but then that would mean that technically, Tokiko's plan actually failed, and she killed herself for nothing. Well, it's all just speculation. For all we know, it could just be the developers having a laugh and putting in a funny scene to spook the player, but it's easy to imagine that there could easily be more to it, especially with the ARG and everything else that I don't really want to get into here. While the obvious and simplest explanation is that it was just a bonus what-if kind of scenario, they did put a lot of stock into the whole moksha thing for them to just throw it out. Of course, there's also the possibility that the whole episode was just another one of Ryuki's delusions. Tying it all back around to the notion of the meta-narrative, I do find that it is fitting. The game introduces you to the concept of the simulation theory, with the simulated world in this case being the game world of AI2. The branching timelines could be the seams in the world code that Tokiko is attempting to break through, hence why inputting the nil number, something that shouldn't really be possible, would trigger a timeline split where Tokiko is able to no-clip through the wall to reach the debug room. Funnily enough, I've seen another common theory that Terror attempted to trigger a similar response by giving you the name Dahlia Boat throughout 2 different timelines, a seemingly meaningless name that ultimately achieves nothing but sound funny because everyone assumes Ryuki is just insane when he says it. Anyways, through this meta-narrative involving simulation theory, it does in a way put the player in the world as a character referred to as the Freyer. Mama even explicitly mentions this when she's explaining the true timeline. Where it does kind of fall short, I think, is that in order for the meta elements to truly shine, they would have had to commit more to expanding on them. Involving the player as the role of the Freyer is fine, I guess, but if the only purpose that the Freyer has in the narrative is to unlock a short Easter egg scene after the game ends, it does feel a little bit underwhelming. Personally, I would have liked to have seen the Diverge route expanded on a lot, to provide a suitable payoff to all the meta elements, but as for what that would entail specifically, I'm not entirely sure. I haven't really thought that far out. Well, all in all, AI2 is a really fun experience. While it has its flaws, and possibly egregious ones at that, it does deliver a charming experience where the murder mystery itself takes a bit of a backseat to the ridiculous antics and character stories. While AI1 ended on a very satisfying self-contained conclusion, I do feel that with AI2 they left the door open for a lot more stories to tell in the Somnium universe. I'm not sure if an AI3 is in the cards or if it's meant to be a reader's interpretation kind of situation, but whatever the future has in store, I'm ready to fray. Just someone tell Oda to get a haircut for the next game.
I would classify that as cringe.
I have escaped the false world of the simulation. Now that I find myself here before you, I must ask one request. Will you help guide me to Super Moksha?